I'm going to open up the waiting room.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chuck Lichtman. I'm a member of the Executive Committee and the Board of Directors of the Jewish Federation of South Palm Beach County, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity today to be the moderator for week 3 again of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a view from the region. And in a few moments, I'm going to reintroduce you Avi Melamed, our presenter. First, I would like to make a big reach out to Judy and Alan Schumann, who have founded and funded the Center for Israel Engagement. And it's because of their wonderful contribution to Federation that we're able to have this great program today. And I know that it's great because I've seen what the attendance has been the first couple of weeks of this presentation, and to be in week 3 and to see that we have over 100 people, 106 people as of right now, with knowing more will admit, shows that we've got a great topic, and we also have, fortunately, a great presenter. Before I get to Avi, let me ask that to the extent any of you have any questions, please email them to me, because I'll be handling the questions while Avi handles the answers. And then let me also remind you that last week when we had this presentation, that was part 2. Avi dealt with 1948 and the Pan-Arabism impact on what happened in that war in 1948 and the founding of Israel. Today, we're moving forward a little bit and we're covering from 1948 to 1967, more on Pan-Arabism, nationalism, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a lot of material to cover, and will get us up to the way of the 1967 war. So I think today is going to be a fascinating presentation. And with that, let me turn it over to our esteemed guest speaker, Avi Melamed. Avi?
Chuck, thank you so much for your kind presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, again, shalom from Israel. I'm very honored and privileged to have this stage. I want to thank you all for providing.
I think Avi got muted.
Just a moment.
There, you were accidentally muted.
Now I'm not.
Now you're not.
I hope so. So again, ladies and gentlemen, shalom from Israel. Chuck, thank you so much for your very kind presentation. Thank you so much for providing me the stage and the opportunity. And as always, let us dive into our third section, which deals with the period of time between 1948 and the war of 1967. As always, I want to start with a short reminder. First, I want again to remind you folks that we are kind of like moving along this chronological timeline, but we also explore this timeline on a different scale. You could see in front of you the scale. You could see the bottom line is the green that stands for regional events. Above that, you could see the red one, the Palestinian nationalism. Above that, you could see the Zionist movement. And on top, you could see the trajectory of the conflict. So all the time, we will be navigating between these different time zones, sort of speaking. And when you look sometimes at the bottom of the slides, you could see sometimes the different time scale. So you could know exactly where are we and what are we exactly looking at. As always, I want to very shortly just refresh our memory talking about three major concepts that we have all the time constantly talked about. The concept of Qawm, Pan-Arabism, that envisioned the creation of one global Arab entity that has no physical boundaries and brings all Arab together under this entity. The concept of Wataniya, the particularistic national statehood notion that you see in the center, colored in purple, that actually says, with all due respect to Pan-Arabism, we believe that there are different distinct features between different Arab communities, and therefore we stand for the creation of an independent Arab states, Lebanon and Syria and Tunisia and Iraq and so on and so on. And then for the right-hand side, you could see colored in green, the concept of caliphate, Islamism, if you wish, that actually says we don't stand either for Wataniya, nor for particularistic national statehood, nor for Al-Qawm, the one Arab big entity. We Islamists stand for the concept of a caliphate, a global Muslim entity that is ruled according to the Islamic religious codex, rather known as Sharia law. Why? Because according to the Islamist believers, Sharia law is a master plan that was given to mankind by Allah himself, and therefore it's obviously flawless and immune from any kind of mistakes. We just concluded the recent session, as Chuck accurately mentioned, and we talked about how Pan-Arabism impacted and influenced the trajectory of the
started again. Everyone sees those crosses.
Maya says there is some problem with the presentation, but let me just stop it and just with your permission, just reshare it with you again. I hope that it will be fine. Is it fine now? Yeah, fine. Looks like fine. We concluded the last session talking about the situation between 1930 and 1948, and one of the major conclusions it mentioned was that, ironically speaking, it was the Arab League who was initiated and established in 1945, actually under the banner of Wataniya, of independent Arab states, even though in one Arab political administrative frame called the Arab League. It was the Arab League who actually initiated the war in 1948 under the banner of Qawm, of Pan-Arabism, and it was very badly managed, planned, and executed, to the point many are kind of like wondering whether this whole war that resulted in a disaster for the Palestinian Arabs and actually dictated the trajectory of the conflict years to come, many people wonder whether this war was nothing more than a lip service of the Arab League to the concept of liberating Palestine, not establishing a Palestinian state. Do not mix between the terms. They were talking about liberating Palestine as an Arab soil, but they did not talk about the establishing of a Palestinian state. So now, when we get to the session today, we are going to explore the situation on the ground from 1948, 1967, and as always, let us start with generally exploring the three major terms, Qawm, Wataniya, and Caliphate. Roughly speaking, when I'm looking at the situation or the picture on the ground, once again, 1950 to the 60s, what I see mostly is major three trends. The Qawm, the pan-Arab ideology, is gaining a lot of momentum. Shortly, we'll understand what was the major power that boosts that momentum. But here you could see under the Qawm list, you could see different milestones, like in 1950, the Transjordan annexed the West Bank Jordan and creates now Jordan under the rule of the Hashemite monarchy. We'll get to that later soon. In 1952, the end of the monarchy in Egypt in a coup, and in 1954, the rise to power of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt and the torch carrier of pan-Arabism. We'll elaborate on that. 1958, the end of the Hashemite monarchy in Iraq, which was very brutal end. 1963, the Ba'ath Party. Remember, we talked about Ba'ath ideology, a socialist model of pan-Arabism that emerged in Syria already in the mid of the 30s. Now in 1963 is coming to power as political power parties in Syria and Iraq. 1964, the Arab League establishing the PLO. We'll get to that and we'll see why is it so interesting in the context of the power struggle between pan-Arabism, Qawm, and Wataniya, particularistic national statehood on the other hand. And of course, 1967, we'll get to that towards the end of our presentation. When you look at the column of the Wataniya, you see something very interesting. There is a strengthening of the concept of particularistic national statehood in the Middle East in the 50s, in the 60s, and it's mostly have to do with the struggle of North Africans, Arab, to get independence. So Libya got its independence in 1951. Libya was under Italian control. Morocco and Tunisia under French control get their independence in 1956. Algeria gets its independence after a violent war against France in the mid of the 1960s. In 1959, an interesting establishment, a phenomenon, the establishing of the Fatah movement. We'll talk about it in the context of Wataniya. And as I mentioned before, Algeria's independence in the mid-60s. And finally, when you look at the Islamist column, you could see something very interesting and significant. During that period of time, Islamists are under the run. The tension, the built-in tension between Islamist ideology, the caliphate vision, and the vision of Wataniya, let alone the vision of pan-Arab, that built-in tension is now coming to the surface in a shape of a wide open collision between Islamists, namely mostly Muslim Brotherhood, and some governments in the Middle East, particularly Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. That is going also to fuel the emergence of militant Islam ideology that we will say something about it later on. So roughly speaking, when we are overall looking at the situation during that period of time, the 50s and the 60s, here are the major bullet points. Egyptian's president Gamal Abdel Nasser that comes to power in 1952 and actually becomes the president in 1954 is the torch carrier of pan-Arabism. he excites the Arab masses, intellectuals, circles as well, talking about this big, glorious vision of pan-Arabism. But also Wataniya, particularistic nationalism, is moving full steam ahead. We just talked about the struggle of North African. We talked about the collision course between Islamist camp, Wataniya and Qawm. And finally, we talked about the emergence of a radical Islamic contemporary thought. Let us look closer a little bit at the story of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the undisputed leader of the Arab world in the 50s and in the 60s as well, even though to a lesser extent. He's carrying the torch of pan-Arabism. He's exciting the masses. He's an enormously charismatic speaker and leader. And he emphasizes once and again the concept of pan-Arabism. In order to enhance his vision, in 1958, he is establishing a coalition, or if you wish, a federation with Syria, and they are creating the United Arab Republic. You can imagine the excitement in the Arab world who believes that auto-to, just around the corner, the whole Arab world is going to be united. Nasser is emphasizing a very significant component in its vision, and that is that Israel is a branch, it's an entity, it's a colonialistic and imperialist Western entity that has been rooted in the Middle East by the Western power and has to be forcefully outrooted. Remember that concept. This is something very significant, and it's not by chance that it's happening exactly during that time, as socialism and communism ideas are capturing more and more some intellectual circles, not only in the Arab world, but also in the Western world. Pan-Arabism, as I mentioned before, is in a track of collision with Islamic ideology, and that's going to bring birth, sort of speaking, to the emergence of radical Islam militant thought. So with all this general atmosphere towards the end of the 40s, following the 1948 war, the 50s and the 60s, let us look for a moment in what's happening in the Palestinian timeline. And we see something very interesting, and that is the establishment of a body that is known by the name of the Government of All Palestine, GAP, if you wish, in short. That body is established by the Arab League following the war in 1948, and it's basically based in Gaza Strip. That body, the Palestinian, the Government of All Palestine, GAP, headed by our friend from the 30s and the 20s and the 40s, Haj Amin al-Husseini, that body actually in October 1948 is basically announcing the establishing of an independent Palestinian state with Jerusalem, Al-Quds, as its capital within the boundaries of May 15, 1948, meaning one day after the establishing of the State of Israel. But do not get confused. It was merely a tool. The GAP was a tool on the chessboard of the big players in the region, and this is the Arab League. The announcement of the GAP about establishing a Palestinian state was formally endorsed by the Arab League. Shortly, we'll see what were the real positions of the members of the Arab League at that time. That announcement was totally not recognized by international community. International community neither recognized GAP nor recognized its statement and announcement about the establishing of an independent Palestinian state. So when you look closer at the way the inter-Arab politics was playing in the context of GAP, you see some very interesting aspects. For example, the Hashemite Jordanian monarchy was totally opposing GAP because GAP was standing for an independent Palestinian entity, and that was totally colliding with the vision and dream of Abdullah, the monarch of Transjordan in 1948, that actually all the time had a dream to basically annex what was known as Palestine under his rule. So you can understand he totally objected that. The Hashemite Iraqi branch, the brother of Abdullah that was ruling Iraq, formally was supporting the story of GAP, but beyond the scene was actually working to fail the whole initiative. Syria and Lebanon supported GAP, but it was most about lining up with the line of Egypt back then and the Arab League. So the bottom line was that GAP didn't really have any real power, even though it was given allegedly sort of sovereignty symbols, like making passports, for example. It didn't really have a real power. It was merely a tool in the hands of the Arab League and particularly Egypt. Egypt, by the way, opposed the presidency, quote unquote, of Amin al-Husseini. And shortly after the announcement, actually, he was forced by the Egyptians to go back to Cairo, and he was arrested in his home by the Egyptians. Basically, what happened was that very quickly in 1952, practically speaking, GAP came to its end, even though formally it came to an end only in 1959. One of the major reasons for that short time story of GAP is the story of the Hashemite monarchy and the significant development in 1950. King Abdullah is annexing parts of Palestine / Eretz Israel, the mandatory parts of Palestine and Eretz Israel. King Abdullah is annexing that part to Jordan. You could see the map in front of you, colored in orange. And now he is annexing part west of the Jordan River. This is a part that was supposed to be part of the Arab state that should have been established according to the Partition Resolution 181 of the United Nations from November 29th, 1947, had the Arab leadership accepted that resolution, but they did not. So in 1950, King Abdullah is annexing the West Bank to Jordan. Amid of protest in the Arab world and particularly Egypt, the bottom line, he annexed the West Bank to Jordan. It becomes part of Jordan, and the people who lived in the West Bank of Jordan, of the Jordan River, namely Palestinian Arabs, most of them are Muslims, some of them are Christians, now become Jordanian citizens. And now the Transjordan Emirate of Jordan is now changing its name to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. The annexation of the West Bank to Jordan was formally recognized by the United Kingdom, apparently by Pakistan as well, and practically, even though not formally, was roughly speaking acknowledged and recognized by most of the international community. So what are the major influence of all this story in the 50s on the Palestinian national identity? One major issue is that as Nasser is positioning himself as the ultimate leader of the Arab world and centers around the concept of socialist-style pan-Arabism inspired by the Baathism, Nasser further emphasized the concept that says Palestine, liberating Palestine is a pan-Arab task. Remember that, because later on it's going to become a booby trap. Another thing that he emphasized is the narrative that says Israel and Zionist movement are Western colonialistic entities and therefore should be eradicated. This is also something that is very significant in years to come, as it's going to become one of the major features of the independent Palestinian national movement. And the common denominator between Nasser's pan-Arabism and the Hashemite pan-Arabism, which were kind of like on a conflicting route, yet they did have one major common denominator, and that is the fact that they both totally rejected and opposed the idea or appearance of a Palestinian particularistic nationalism. Let us turn our look at the ground. What's going on the ground, the land of Israel? Israel already back then, and Palestine. In demography, look at this chart in front of you. Look at the figures in the 40s and look at the figures in the 50s. You see the sharp decline in the number of Muslims. That is, of course, the outcome of the 1948 war. We talked about the issue of the Nakba in the Arab terminology, which refers to the issue of the Arab refugees that fled as an outcome of the war. They are going later on to be known by the name of the Palestinian refugees. So you could see how the numbers decreased significantly when you look at the numbers of Muslims inside Israel. Notice that, inside Israel, because now there is a larger number of Muslims in the West Bank, which is reminding you that time under the rule of Jordan. Look at the Jewish population, a tremendous jump from 450,000 people in 1940 to 1.2 million in 1950, in a decade. This is an amazing and significant jump in the number of the population. Look at the decreasing number of Christians, again, attributed to the outcome of the war. Later on, this number is going to start rising up again. Let us look, roughly speaking, at the Israeli arena. In the 50s and the 60s, Israel is struggling. The most significant thing, I would say, is the fact that Israel is absorbing an enormous wave of aliyah. Jews, people who survived the Holocaust, Jews who fled from the Arab world, like my grandfather who fled from Iraq and his families following the massacres and persecutions of Jews in the Arab world. Almost 1 million Jews fled from the Arab world as the Israeli-Arab conflict was further escalating. Israel absorbed something like 1/3 of these people. So in a time period of 3 years, Israel population was doubled from 600,000 people to 1.2 million people. This is enormous. And of course, it's a major burden economically, socially, politically, which translated to a major economic crisis in Israel in the 50s and the 60s. Meanwhile, parallel to that, we are witnessing an escalation of security on the ground as Israel is facing an increasing numbers of attacks initiated by groups that are operating from Gaza Strip that is controlled by Egypt back then, or from the West Bank that is controlled by Jordan, or from Jordan itself, and also continuing shells of Syrian artillery pounding Israeli communities in the Galilee in the north part of Israel. So let us just shortly look at the road so far. Look at these lines, look at these timelines, look at the colors, look at the bottom line. You see these stair-shaped colors of Qawm, Pan-Arabism, how it's rising up in the middle of the 50s, how it's rising up according to some milestones, like, for example, Nasser is coming to power in 1954, it's rising up. The Sinai War in 1956, a war between Egypt on the one hand and an Israeli-English-French coalition on the other hand, also contribute enormously to the popularity of Nasser in the Arab world. Notice also the purple color that stands for Wataniya. Notice how it rises up. It has to do mostly with what I said before, the rising for independence of North African Arabs. But now I want you to look at the Palestinian timeline, the red line. Notice how small the marks of Palestinian national particularistic identity is. Why? Because that time, large parts of what's supposed to be Palestine, according to the partition resolution, what's supposed to be the Arab state, the West Bank is ruled by Jordan. So they are Jordanian citizens. This is their nationality. They are Jordanians. They are Palestinians by origin, but they are by citizenship, they are Jordanian citizens. If you see, you could see that there is a short line here somewhere in the mid of between 1948 and 1952, which is a little bit higher. Why? Because it reflects the story of GAP, Government of All Palestine. That was somewhat some sign of kind of like beginning of Palestinian independence, but it was not really a real one, as we saw earlier. Look later on, right here in this far end, in 1959, we'll get it's going up. And the reason for that is the establishment of the Fatah movement. So let us go back and explore once again the Qawm, Wataniya, and Caliphate terms in the 60s. What we see is a triangular power struggle that evolves in the 60s between Qawm, Wataniya, and Islamism. On the one hand, Nasser's pan-Arabism is challenging dynasties in the Arab world. It is challenging the Hashemites, who are concerned with pan-Arabism. It is challenging the Saudi monarchy. In 1962, between 1962 and 1970, militarily speaking, Egypt is directly involved in a war in Yemen between Republicans in North Yemen and the monarchy in North Yemen. The involvement of the Egyptians is an outcome of the pan-Arabism vision of Nasser. But the Saudi monarchy is very much concerned with the outcome of that war because it could radiate on the monarchy itself. So the Saudis are supporting the Yemenite monarchy. Nasser is supporting the Republicans in North Yemen. And this is another stage that you could see this collision between the pan-Arabism and monarchies in the Arab world. Meanwhile, inspired by the growing role of Ba'ath in Syria and Iraq in the mid-50s and the 60s, but mostly inspired by the struggle of North Africa for independence, we are witnessing the establishing of the Fatah movement in 1959 in Kuwait, which actually brings in an interesting mixture of vague agenda that is partly Qawm, meaning they are standing partly for pan-Arabism, but it's also partly Wataniya. They are emphasizing particularistic national Palestinian identity. This is a milestone. This is a beginning of a change. There is a counter-reaction to that. The Arab League, and particularly Egypt and the Ba'ath, are not so happy with that development because the independence Palestinian particularistic sentiment is opposing the vision of pan-Arabism. And they react. How do they react? By establishing in 1964 in Jerusalem, which is of course back then under the Jordanian rule. I'm talking about the Jordanian part of Jerusalem. They are establishing the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, that is actually established as a counterweight to the story of Fatah. And indeed, PLO from the beginning was affiliated with pan-Arabism, with the Qawm concept, less emphasizing the concept of independent Palestinian national sentiment. And finally, as I said before, we are also witnessing during this decade this growing escalation and collision between Qawm, Wataniya on the one hand, and Islamists on the other hand. One of the outcomes of that interesting trajectory was the appearance of what is going to become a very significant phenomenon in the Middle East and beyond, and that is a militant Islam ideology. It is not new. It's always been around, but in the 50s and the 60s, one man, Said Qutb, an Egyptian scholar that, by the way, spent some time in the States as a scholar, is basically solidifying and brings this whole ideas of militant radical Islam into one cohesive theory. And he brings the idea that says the only way Muslims can live and should live their life, and the only way Islam could heal, Muslim could heal, is if they will strictly adopt and apply Islamic religious law. I hope that maybe sometime in the future we'll have the opportunity to elaborate on the whole story of Said Qutb and contemporary militant Islam, radical Islam ideology, because it's a fascinating story. But one of the most significant aspects of its ideology was the one that says, if an Arab government and rulers fail to comply with the implementation of the strict Sharia law, they, meaning the rulers or the government, should be ousted by all means. You may be interested to know that to a large extent, the person that you see in front of you, Said Qutb, and his ideology laid the foundation of what is going later on to be known, for example, by the name of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So what is the whole influence on the Palestinian independence national characteristic or features based upon what I said so far? So one of the significant thing is that Nasser, pursuing the vision of pan-Arabism, socialist pan-Arabism, and pursuing the vision of positioning himself as the ultimate leader of the Arab world, the one that leads the Arab world towards horizon of glory and triumph. He basically says liberating Palestine is a pan-Arab task. We mentioned that before. He once again further emphasized the concept of Israel is a Western colonialistic entity that has to be outrooted. Once again, we talked about the common denominator between Nasser's pan-Arabism and Hashemite pan-Arabisms. And the common denominator is that they strictly reject the idea of independent Palestinian particularistic nationalism. We saw that how they did that when they established the PLO in 1964 as a counterweight to the Fatah movement. So where are we now when we look at the big picture, 1950 to 1967? Once again, let us look at the colors and let us start with the lower part. You see to the left-hand side, the stair shape rising of pan-Arabism. We mentioned 1954, Nasser comes to power. 1956, the Sinai War that basically further boosts Nasser popularity. Look at the rise. You could see that in the color, in the orange color. Notice the purple color that is constantly on the rise, meaning Wataniya, meaning particularistic statehood in the world, in the Arab world. You see more and more how these two powers are kind of like getting more and more equal, sort of speaking. Look at the second part here to the right-hand side, the 60s, roughly speaking. Notice how pan-Arabism is starting to decline. People are starting to be disappointed, sort of speaking, with the whole vision of pan-Arabism. In 1951, United Arab Community, the unification between Syria and Egypt comes to an end in a very ugly way. In 1962, the war in Yemen and the involvement of Egypt in the war in Yemen that brought a disaster crisis in Yemen also make people more and more skeptic about this whole vision of pan-Arabism. Now you see here an interesting point where you see in the midst of this downscaling, there is a lifting, a rise, sort of speaking, a short time rise up. And this is the fact that in 1963, Ba'ath, socialist model of pan-Arabism, is taking power in the Arab world. But you could notice the trend in the 60s. Look what's going on. It's starting, pan-Arabism, it's starting to decline. Nasser is starting to lose popularity. And remember that because this is very significant. Now, I want you to look at the red line, and I want you to notice two interesting things. One here in 1959, you see two colors. One is the purple, and next to that, you see the orange color. This is the year when Fatah is established. Those two colors actually symbolizes that when we look at the Palestinian particularistic national statehood, we see that with the establishment of Fatah, we see something very interesting. We see a body that is a combination of the two, pan-Arabism colored orange and particularistic nationalism colored purple. But you see that the purple is a little bit higher than the orange, meaning it is more dominant. Now I want you to look here in the mid-60s. This is 1964. Remember, this is the milestone of establishing of the PLO. Notice how the ratio between the two lines is now flipped over. Now it is more orange, meaning it is more affiliating with Pan-Arabism, and it's less purple, meaning it's less affiliated with the concept of Palestinian particularistic nationalism. When you see these two, the way they dialogue, notice how they are in compliance with the whole situation in the general timeline. You see Pan-Arabism, you see when Pan-Arabism is declining right here. At the same time, there is an attempt of Pan-Arabism to regain force, to regain power. And one of the ways to do that is through the story of the Palestinian National Movement, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And one last thing, notice here, the middle of the 60s, how the particularistic nationalism is on the rise in the Arab world. This is the point of time where the struggle of North Africans is finally ended with triumph. They get their independence, and some of them get their independence following a brutal war when they sacrifice, like, for example, Algeria. This is very significant in the context of the trajectory also of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So in the mid-60s, Nasser is losing momentum. Pan-Arabism vision of Nasser is becoming less attractive and less exciting. Reality is knocking on the door. Challenges are increasing in different ways, politically, economically, socially. Egypt is involved in this brutal war in Yemen that nobody really understands what's the purpose of that. The masses are kind of like starting to get away once again from the story of Pan-Arabism. And at the same time, we see how particularistic nationalism is on the rise, reminding you the purple line. Nasser is losing momentum, and Nasser is looking for ways to restore both the dream of Pan-Arabism, the socialist model, and the dream of Nasser as the leader of the Arab world that will lead the Arab world to the golden shores. He looks around and he finds a possible mechanism to that end, and that is to initiate a calculated military escalation with Israel, hoping that, like in the war in 1956, that will help him to regain popularity and momentum. Nasser actually took a gamble, and that was a wrong gamble, because it's going to end up with a military collision that spun out of control, became an out-all war between Arab states and Israel, known as the 1967 war. And the results of the war, once again, are catastrophic for Arab world, for the Palestinian national movement, but also in a way in the context of the trajectory of the whole conflict. Israel occupies the West Bank. You see the map in front of you. Israel occupies the Sinai Peninsula. Israel occupies the Golan Heights. In the Arab terminology, the 1967 war is known by the name of Naksa. Remember, in 1948, it was Nakba, which means a severe medical condition. Naksa means the repeat of that severe medical condition, but 10 times worse than it was before. We'll talk in our next session about the impact of the defeat, the Arab defeat in the 1967 war. So to conclude our session today, when we are looking at the 50s and the 60s, I would say the stormy 50s and the 60s in the Middle East, we see once again how during those 2 decades, inter-Arab politics dictate the path and fate of the Palestinians and hence the course of the conflict. We saw the example of GAP, the Government of All Palestine, who had a short acceptancy from 1948 to 1952, practically, until it was formally ended in 1959. We saw how it was, in the end of the day, nothing more than a tool on the chessboard of the inter-Arab politics. We saw how that countering the establishing of the gap, Hashemite monarchy in Jordan, King Abdullah is annexing parts of Palestine, the West Bank, and now it becomes part of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. We saw how, inspired by the rise of Ba'athism in the Arab world, and particularly the struggle of North Africans and the percolating of the narratives of fighting imperialism, fighting colonialism, and associating Israel with those concepts, we saw how that inspired the establishing of the Fatah movement in the late 1950s, which could be considered actually as the first time that we are really witnessing the emergence of a structured, particularistic Palestinian national movement. But then again, we saw how back then in the 50s and the 60s, that was totally not welcomed by the major players in the Arab world. The Arab League, Egypt, Jordan, they are not excited, to say the least, with the establishment of the Fatah. So as a counter move, they are establishing the PLO that emphasize not Palestinian particularistic national sentiment, but rather a pan-Arabism features. And we saw how, with the declining of pan-Arabism and Nasser's position, particularly in the second part of the 60s, Nasser is looking for ways to restore its popularity and power, and he is making a gamble, which appears to be a bad gamble, and he is initiating the war that ends up with the agonizing defeat of the Arab world in 1967. However, and here is where we are concluding our session today, at the same time, the outcome of this war, together with the declining of pan-Arabism concept, together with the rising and deepening concept of Wataniya, particularistic national statehood in the Arab world, all those things comes together, coincide, and actually one of the most significant outcome is that they are going to further accelerate the emergence of an independent Palestinian particularistic movement. And that, of course, is going to make a big impact on the trajectory of the Israeli-Arab conflict. In fact, in our next session, we will now see how the conflict now is going back to become an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm concluding my presentation so far, and obviously, I'm looking forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Avi. That was extremely enlightening and educating, I think, probably to all of us. We don't get that kind of analysis in local publications here unless you pick up distinct books at the library or the bookstore. So that was really enlightening. I have a few questions from people, and I have a few questions myself. And one that intrigued me, and I might be a little bit ahead of myself in terms of your next presentation, but you commented about, in 1963, the Ba'ath Party, how that was, that tied Syria and Iran together. And I think that was close to the time that Saddam Hussein was at least involved in the military. And as we know, the Ba'ath Party stayed in existence till Saddam Hussein was no longer around. But what intrigues me is that Syria was involved. And I'm wondering, how did it come about that Syria shifted its viewpoints, since the Hussein family had run, a different branch of the Hussein family had run Syria over to Iran? Because it seems to me they stopped being part of the Ba'ath Party. Was that geography, or was that petrodollars, or what caused that?
Well, actually, I'm not sure, but I was talking about Syria and Iraq, not
I
Iran.
meant to say Iraq. I said Iraq. Saddam Hussein.
You said Iraq. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. For some reason, I thought you said Iran.
Yeah. No. But shifted over. Syria seems to have shifted its alliance to Iran some time ago, actually. So was that
Well,
based on petrodollars? Was it geography? What caused that?
the Syrian-Iranian relationship is something that is actually going to develop and evolve later on. And actually, we will talk about it towards the concluding part of the series once we'll get there. But you're right in your observation when you are indicating this interesting and very significant development, because when we'll get to there, and that will be actually in the final session, we will see how this shift, or the Syrian shift towards the Iranian, and particularly I'm talking about the Mullah regime, how is that so significantly impacting right now what we see in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So this is a very accurate observation, but you, as you said before, you're right, you're a little bit ahead of time. We'll have to get there, and we'll get there in the concluding part of this session, of the program.
I suspect that a great many of us that are on the presentation today grew up hearing about Nasser and had this very firm belief ingrained in us that Nasser was a really evil guy out to eradicate Israel. I think you kind of made that clear. I just want to clarify, was his loss of popularity in Egypt due to his gamble on military escalation of war with Israel? Is that what caused his downfall?
Well, that's a great question. Here is something very interesting. Following the defeat, Nasser basically took responsibility and said, I'm resigning. People were chanting in the street and crying and begging him not to go. So he stayed in power. Nasser in the Arab, at least in the Arab myth, has been and is almost a mythical figure. Although, of course, there has been many studies in the Arab world and intellectual circles that basically were able to look at Nasser for what he really was and to judge his heritage, in terms of narratives and myth, Nasser is one of the biggest myths of the Arab world. And by the way, historians were debating and are debating whether Nasser really wanted to initiate a war with Israel. They basically, some of them says like he didn't really want to have a war. He was gambling, he was walking on the edge. He was doing some steps on the ground, seemingly towards war, but he didn't really want war. But again, this is kind of like historical, interesting debate that is kind of like a little bit retrospective. I can tell you personally, as someone who was born in Jerusalem in 1960, when the city was divided. I was born in 1960 in Jerusalem. The city was divided. I remember that, even though I was only 6 years old when the war broke out, I remember the agonies and the fears of the Israelis, of the people, because war was upon us. And it seems very frightening with all this mass of arms, Arab Syrian forces and Egyptian forces and Jordanian forces. You can understand why in the Israeli, and we'll talk about it in the next session, there was a big relief following that war. So looking retrospectively is one thing. Look at things when they happened on real time, it's another thing. But just the same, Nasser basically remained as a big figure, a big time figure in the Arab myth. And this is something which for itself is an interesting issue to explore.
So
he was charismatic. He was an amazing, charismatic spokesperson. He really excited the masses.
So a couple of our people had asked questions about Jordan. I'm going to try to consolidate them for time purposes, and because they're not, because they're sort of somewhat unrelated. The first is whether or not the people that live in Jordan that we consider to be Palestinians, whether or not they still have Palestinian citizenship. And then the second, which is somewhat related, is a question as to whether or not Jordan should be the Palestinian state and if that could happen. And those seem to be kind of related. If you could address that, please.
So I'll start with the second question, which is, of course, some sort of political question. Obviously, I'm not going to express any political view. I'm just going to say as a fact, the Jordanians are totally resenting and opposing and rejecting the whole concept that says Jordan is Palestine. The Jordanians are saying Jordan is Jordan and there should be an independent Palestinian state next to the state of Israel and next to the state of Jordan. This is the official position of the Jordan monarchy. Referring to the first question, we'll say something about it in the next session or beyond it, but actually, roughly speaking, in 1988 and in 1992, Jordan actually disassociated itself, administratively speaking, from the West Bank. But the Jordanians, most of the Jordanian citizens today are originally Palestinians, meaning they are originally from Palestine. They are Jordanian citizens, also including the people that were refugees. Jordan is the only Arab state that granted Palestinian refugees with Jordanian citizenship. The Palestinians who live today in the West Bank and Gaza Strip are actually under the control of the Palestinian National Authority in the West Bank and Hamas government in the Gaza Strip. They don't have Jordanian citizenship, though they have, at least those in the West Bank, they also have a Jordanian passports that enables them to move from Israel or Palestine to Jordan through the borders, but they are not Jordanian citizens. They do have rights to purchase assets in Jordan, to have business in Jordan, and stuff like that, but they are not Jordanian citizens. So that refers to the first question that you mentioned.
Okay. Well, here's some questions on the UAR. Two different people also asked about the UAR, and they're similar questions as well. And the first is, were the governments of Egypt, Syria, and Iraq also very similar or the same? And the second question was, why did the UAR fall apart?
Well, starting with the question, first, the UAR was actually Egypt and Syria, not Iraq, but also Yemen. That was some sort of part of this structure. Yemen was some sort, even not fully part of that structure, as a sort of a federation, not Iraq. Now, there was major differences between, in the end of the day, between the Egyptian government and the Syrian government during that period of time, though they were both mostly ruled by socialist ex-officers, sort of speaking, or people that came from the military establishment vis-a-vis or during a coup. There has been some substantial differences between the Egyptian government and the Syrian government. There has been a lot of differences between the Egyptians and the Syrians, roughly speaking, in terms of dialect, in terms of terminology, in terms of tradition, in terms of narratives, in many ways. To a large extent, and that basically leads to the answer to the following question, to a large extent, in the end of the day, this uniting entity was to a large extent very artificial. It didn't really have wide foundations to stand upon. The fact that they were both Arabs was not enough for itself. Egyptians emphasized, for example, other than the Arab component, Egyptians emphasized, for example, the fact that they are centers around the enormous legacy of pharaohs in Egypt and the whole magnificent times of the Egyptian ancient empires. In Syria, you found Syrian nationalists that actually brought different chapters of the history of Syria to center around. There was no one big narrative in Syria that was dominating in sense of other than ethnical identity that was as powerful as the story of the Pharaohite and the Egyptian ancient kingdoms, the way it brings Egyptians around it. So there has been a lot of major differences. And finally, the economies were different. The military structure and capacities were different. Priorities were totally different. While Egyptians are, roughly speaking, mostly one big, very solid structure, Syria is a fractions of ethnical groups, subdominations and others. So in the end of the day, it was very clear that the odds that something like that could really evolve into something that is really standing for united, cohesive entity, the odds were very low, and accordingly, of course, was the outcome. It failed.
So we have time for just one more question. I think that present day, probably everybody that's listening in understands the difference between PLO and Fatah and Hamas. But let's go back in time to the 60s. And if maybe you could spend a moment just describing what the difference was. I don't even think Hamas existed back then, but as to PLO and Fatah, if you could explain to people the difference between those organizations back then again.
Sure. First, Hamas did not exist back then. Hamas is going to emerge in the late 80s. Fatah was established in the late 1950s in Kuwait. It was established by Yasser Arafat and a couple of his colleagues. And basically, Fatah was established, and it was really inspired by the struggle of North African, the concept also of socialist Ba'athism, but Fatah was really more towards the issue of particularistic Palestinian national statehood. Fatah was really emphasizing the concept of independent Palestinian state, that its capital is Al-Quds, Jerusalem, and Fatah emphasized also the concept that is known as the armed struggle, al-kifah al-musallah in Arabic, which means in order to achieve that goal, Israel has to be eradicated through violence. This is the armed struggle of the Fatah. And it's part of the sentiment or the narrative that I mentioned before, where Nasser was emphasizing time and again the story of Israel is a Western colonialistic entity that has to be eradicated. In that sense, there was a common denominator between Fatah and Nasser. Remember what I told you. Other than that, Nasser was not so happy with the fact that now in 1959, he has this Palestinian particularistic national movement that is obviously confronting his vision of pan-Arabism and his status as the ultimate leader of the Arab world. The PLO, therefore, established in 1964 by the Arab League, namely Egypt and Jordan, basically to counterweight the Fatah. And the PLO was established. It also centers around the concept of armed struggle, meaning it also vowed to eliminate Israel because it's a rapist entity, it's a colonialistic entity, and so on and so on, all the slogans. Notice that the first chairman of the PLO was Ahmad Shukairi, a originally Lebanese politician that has also some Turkish roots and some Saudis roots. He was the first chairman of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which actually shows you what was the real identity of the PLO. By the way, it wouldn't take long, within a couple of years after 1967, where Fatah is going to take over the PLO. In the struggle between the two, Fatah won, and Fatah basically now took PLO as a shell, and now Fatah, following the 1967 war, actually became the dominant factor of the PLO.
Great. Thank you so much. So I appreciate everybody's attendance today. Let me thank again Judy and Alan Schuman for their funding of the Center for Israel Engagement and the presentation that you've seen today in the last 2 weeks and for the next 3 weeks. And also those at Federation like Erica Gordon and Ida Novak, who've been spending so much time putting this together. Thank you, ladies. And look forward to seeing all of you again next week. With that, over and out. Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.